So this video tutorial is going to explain the read-in users function. And this is an important function or method rather that you need to run at the outset whenever your program first loads. And what it does is it takes the student CSV file, which is in backend storage, and it brings it into main memory, and it loads it into a two-dimensional array. Well, it does that eventually. It doesn't do that initially for reasons that I'll explain in a wee second. So the variables that you need for this particular method, I've created 4 or 5 global variables that you can access then throughout your program. So you need the path, which is where the file is stored, and the file is stored at this path, and all this here really is the file name, and there's no pathway as such because it's stored in exactly the same folder as the executable file. So in other words, it doesn't need to go looking for it, it's there beside it. So that's why there's no pathway as such, it's just the name of the file. Then we have a one-dimensional array, and this one-dimensional array will initially store the users as it's read in from this location. And this particular file, or this array, sorry, is created to the exact size of the number of rows in this CSV file. So this little function here will find the file stored at that path, and it will find the number of rows based on how many lines are in the CSV file. So this returns a string, which is the of all the lines, and then this then counts the number of rows in that of this string object. So that counts the number of rows in this string object, which is essentially an array. So that will go to this file, and we'll see that there are 12 rows, and essentially that will populate this here, or initialize that to 12. The next global variable is number of students, and that will essentially will look at the array and count the number of rows in the users array. Now I could just set that to, I could just use that variable there, or that little method, and just do it that way. I want this to be dynamic. In other words, I want this each time it loads the program to check the number of rows in this CSV file, because this CSV file will only get bigger as time goes on. So every time it reads it in, it needs to check the length of it. So I set the number of students to check the length of the array, which is checking the length of the file, the CSV file. So that's dynamic, it changes each time. The number of bits of info, or the number of columns, if you like, doesn't change. It's always 10. So no matter how many students I read in, there's always 10 bits of information for each student. Okay, so that's fixed at 10. The last global variable that I need is the two-dimensional array itself. And the two-dimensional array, which is the number of rows by the number of columns. And to denote a two-dimensional array, it looks like creating an array, only put a little comma in between the square brackets. Okay, so that tells the program that there's 2 dimensions. Okay, and those 2 dimensions, then to tell it what the 2 dimensions are, you put an int variable, what equates to an int variable here, and what equates to an int variable here. So that's number of students for rows and the number of bits of info for columns. So rows and columns. How many rows? How many columns? There are 12 rows by 10 columns. So that's creating a two-dimensional array, 12 rows in length by 10 columns in breadth. Now, that's the global variables created. Whenever in the main method then, I call the main menu, which loads the menu options that you see. And then I call read-in users. And read-in users in the background loads the CSV file from backend storage into main memory. So let's look at the read-in users method. So static void read-in users, there's no parameters being sent to it here, so it just does what it needs to do. I've used a try catch. As we know, a try catch is used to capture any exceptions which might happen, any bugs if you like, and we normally put try blocks around any data input, and this is data input as such. It's reading data from a file, so I need to put the try around it. And what I'm doing here is into this one-dimensional array. If you remember that users is a single dimensional array, and I've instantiated it, or I've created it up here, so it's created an array which is capable of holding 12 rows of information. So now what I've done, because that array's already been created, I'm reading in the actual data from the CSV file. So I'm reading in file.readAllLines, I'm passing it the path. So I'm telling it where to go to find the file, and I'm reading all the lines in, and I'm populating this users array. So each row in this array will be a line from this CSV file. So each row in that users array is a line or is a position in that one-dimensional array. If there are any input problems, now typically there is a file not found exception. So if that file wasn't there, that issue would be caught in this object here. And I've just made that up. You could call it whatever you want. I'm just calling it file not found exception, and that would capture the problem, and then I could output it to a string. Okay, that says type any kit. I should say type any key to continue. So now I've got at this point in the program, the file should have successfully read in the CSV file into working memory. So it's now in this users array, but it's still not in the two-dimensional array. It's in the single-dimensional array. But at this point, it's read in from the CSV file. So we're no longer working with this CSV file, so it's gone. So now what I need to do is I need to create another one-dimensional array. And this one-dimensional array is going to store each row of the users array that I've created. So the users array stores all these each row of information for each student in each position in the array. Now what this temp student array is going to do is it is going to store each row of information in an array. So in other words, it's going to break up each row as separated by the commas, and it's going to store it in this array. So each time this is used, this is going to store a different record, student record, or student row, if you like. And that needs to be, in size, it needs to be equal to the number of bits of info. Okay, so each student has 10 bits of information about them. So that needs to be able to store every bit of information about each student. Now we're into the nested for part of the final part of the code. And what this does is we've got an outer loop and an inner loop. The outer loop controls movement through the rows, and it will move through each row as determined by the number of students. In other words, the number of students is equal to the number of rows. So that will go through each row. So the first time it goes in, it's going to the users one-dimensional array, and it's going to the first row in that users one-dimensional array. So imagine this was the users one-dimensional array. I know it's a CSV file, but that's what it would look like in the users one-dimensional array. And it's going through the first row, and it's splitting. Remember, the first row is determined by I, and I is currently 0. So it's going through this first row. I is equal to 0. That's, remember, in an array, the first index position is 0. And it's splitting the row up by each comma delimited value. And it's splitting it up, and it's adding each value that is split by a comma into each position of the temp student array. So in other words, in this temp student array, it's going to put that into position 0, that into position 1, that into position 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So that is going to be stored in this temporary student array. Now, and here's the key bit. The inner loop then is going to iterate through the columns, okay, or as determined by the int variable j. And it's going to iterate through the columns as determined by the number of bits of info. And we know that is 10. So in other words, for each row, it's going to go through 10 columns. And it's going to use the value of I and j to write then each student into each row of the two-dimensional array. So let's say, for example, the first time into this loop, I is set to 0. So it goes to position 0 in the users array, which is this row in the users array. It then splits each user up by the comma separated variable, and it assigns to each position in the temporary student array. So that is position 0, that is position 1, and so on. Then it writes each value stored in this temp student array as determined by the counter j. So in other words, whenever j is 0, it's going to take this value, E Martin 680, and it's going to write that to row 0, because I is still on the first, that's the outer loop. So I is 0. And for the first value, j is going to be 0. So it's going to write the value stored in the temp student array in position 0, because j is 0. And it's going to write that value to the two-dimensional array as determined by the I and j variables. So I is 0 and j is 0, so it's going to write E Martin 680 to coordinate 0, 0, if you like, in that grid. Then it's going to increment the counter, j++, j is now going to be 1. And is j less than the number of bits of info? Yes, 2 is less than 10, so it goes back in here, and then it goes to the second, or position 1 in the temporary student array. So it finds Errol, and it writes it to position I, j in the two-dimensional array. I is still 0 and j is 1, so it writes Errol to position row I, column 1 in the two-dimensional array. And it keeps iterating through the temp student array, writing each value in the temp student array to that first row in the two-dimensional array until such times as there's no more information to write. In other words, when j is no longer less than the number of bits of info, whenever j is 10. So in other words, at this point here, when there is no more bits of information, then it will go back to the outer loop and increment the counter. I is now 1. So then it goes to the first row, index position 1 in the user array. So it goes to K Martin 917. And it writes, then it splits that row up by the comma separated variables or values, and it writes each value in this row to this temporary student array, and it repeats the process over and over again until such times as it's gone through each student and it's written each student to each new row in the two-dimensional array as determined by the I and j counters in the outer and inner loops. And that is it. Any problems, you can refer to the code in the REPL, or you can ask me in class.